Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. So this time we're diving into the origins of the Black Power movement in the U.S. You've given us some really interesting sources here, especially those excerpts from the History podcast about the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X.
It's fascinating stuff for sure.
Get ready for some powerful stories and insights.
Yeah, it's important to understand that the concept of Black Power didn't just kind of emerge in a vacuum.
Right.
There were decades of evolving thought and activism that led up to it.
Yeah.
And the Nation of Islam played a particularly crucial role.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. What exactly was the Nation of Islam and what made it so influential?
Well, even before the Nation of Islam, you had this idea floating around of black separatism in the U.S.
Yeah.
This idea of going back to Africa to escape racism and segregation in the U.S.
Right, like creating a separate black nation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this desire, this kind of desire, found a really powerful voice in Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association,
Right.
or the UNIA in the early 1900s.
Early 20th century.
His message of black pride and independence and self-sufficiency really resonated deeply with people.
Yeah, his slogan, Africa for Africans, is still so powerful today.
Absolutely.
It really captures that idea of Black people worldwide taking control of their own destiny.
It does. And you can see how these ideas, of black nationalism and separatism kind of then feed into the formation of the Nation of Islam in the 1930s.
Yeah, you're right. It's like a direct line from one to the other.
It is. The Nation of Islam, or the NOI,
Right.
was founded by Wallace Fard Muhammad and later led by Elijah Muhammad.
Right.
And what's really interesting about the NOI is that they didn't just talk about going back to Africa. They blended these religious teachings with this idea of racial empowerment, preaching that black people were the original people of the world.
So they were reclaiming history.
Exactly.
And building a sense of identity that had been denied to them by racism.
Absolutely.
It's almost like they were saying, we're not starting from behind, we're the foundation.
Exactly. And by the 1960s, their message continues to evolve. And they emphasized that true freedom for black Americans could only come through self-sufficiency and separation from white society.
So they weren't looking for integration or assimilation.
They saw those things as perpetuating the existing power structure.
Okay.
They condemned the racism that was deeply rooted in America, and they promoted economic independence, black pride, and creating this kind of self-sustaining black community.
And this is where Malcolm X comes in, right?
Exactly.
He was such a powerful voice for the NOI.
He was. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, joined the NOI in the 1940s.
Right.
And he had a truly transformative experience in prison that led him to the NOI, and he quickly rose through the ranks. And he became this incredible spokesperson known for his sharp critiques of white America.
Yeah, he was so charismatic and outspoken. His statement that freedom should be achieved by any means necessary really resonated with people who were frustrated with the slow pace of change through nonviolent methods.
Yes.
In fact, in those sources that you brought in, you highlighted that quote specifically.
Sure.
What was it about that message that resonated with you?
It's something that was really controversial back then.
Yeah.
And even today, people have strong feelings about it.
Right.
It makes you think about what it really means to fight for justice.
Yeah.
And what tactics are acceptable.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that even Malcolm X's own views evolved over time.
Absolutely. His pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964 was a turning point.
Right.
He met Muslims of all races and started to embrace a more inclusive approach to racial justice.
So that experience really challenged his previous beliefs about separation, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. He eventually broke away from the Nation of Islam and founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And his focus shifted toward intersectionality, connecting the struggles of black Americans with global liberation movements. It's fascinating to think about how much his thinking changed in just a few years.
It is. But even though he moved away from the NOI, his earlier message about black pride, self-defense, and rejecting racial assimilation had a huge impact.
Oh, yeah?
It really laid the groundwork for the Black Power movement.
It absolutely did. Figures like Stokely Carmichael, who popularized the term Black Power.
Right.
And organizations like SNCC and the Black Panther Party were all influenced by those ideas.
It's interesting how those early ideas about separation, even though Malcolm X himself moved away from them,
Right.
still fueled this new movement focused on Black empowerment.
Yeah, and it makes you think about how different things might have been if Malcolm X had lived longer.
Yeah.
You know, his death in 1965 was such a loss.
Definitely his vision was evolving so rapidly.
Yeah.
It's hard not to wonder what direction he might have taken the movement in, but even without him, the Black Power movement took on a life of its own right.
It did. And it wasn't just a continuation of Malcolm X's ideas.
Right.
You know, the NOI and its ideas continue to evolve as well. What's your take on their impact separate from Malcolm X's legacy?
Well, it's clear that the NOI had a major influence on the Black Power movement's emphasis on self-reliance and economic empowerment.
Absolutely. And the
Yes.
NOI's focus on building strong Black communities and institutions definitely resonated with the Black Power movement's goals.
And that focus on economic independence is really interesting when you think about it.
Yeah.
You know, it's like it foreshadows some of the conversations we're having today around Black entrepreneurship and building generational wealth, wouldn't you say?
It definitely does.
Yeah.
That idea of creating economic power within the Black community
Yeah.
is a thread that runs through so much of Black history.
Right.
And it's still relevant today.
It is. And speaking of the Black Power movement, it's important to remember that it wasn't just one monolithic thing. There were so many different groups and individuals with varying ideas about how to achieve Black liberation.
That's right. You had groups like the Black Panther Party who embraced armed self-defense
Right.
and community organizing.
Yeah.
They were pretty controversial, but they also provided these vital services like free breakfast programs for children
Right.
and health clinics.
They were really focused on addressing the immediate needs of their communities.
Yes.
While also challenging the systems that created those needs in the first place.
Exactly. And they weren't afraid to be confrontational. They challenged police brutality and systemic racism head on.
Yeah.
But you also had other groups who took a different approach,
Right.
focusing more on cultural and educational programs.
Like the U.S. organization founded by Maulana Karenga.
Exactly.
They were all about promoting Black pride and cultural unity.
Exactly. So while there was this shared emphasis on Black pride, self-determination, and economic empowerment, the strategies for getting there were diverse.
Yeah.
And that makes it hard to define Black power as one thing.
It was more of a movement of movements, wasn't it?
I think that's a great way to put it. It was a cultural and political force that really reshaped American society.
It definitely challenged the status quo.
Yes.
And forced America to confront its history of racial injustice. And it wasn't just limited to Black Americans.
Right.
It inspired other marginalized groups to stand up and fight for their rights, too.
It's amazing to see how far those ideas have spread.
Yeah.
You know, we can see the ripple effects all over the world, even today.
It makes you realize that these fights for justice are all interconnected, don't you think?
They are.
So thinking back on everything we've talked about, from early Black separatism to the rise of the Black Power movement, what stands out to you as the most important takeaway?
Well, for me, it's this powerful reminder that history isn't just a bunch of facts and dates. You know, it's a living, breathing story of ideas, actions, and consequences.
Right.
And we can't truly understand the present without grappling with the complexities of the past.
Right. And the legacy of the Black Power movement is still being felt today. The fight for racial justice continues.
Yeah.
And those ideas of Black pride, self-determination, and economic empowerment are just as relevant now as they were back then.
They are. And I think it's also really important to remember that individuals can spark incredible change.
Yeah.
Figures like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X,
Right.
even with their flaws and contradictions,
Yeah.
really help shape the course of history.
It's truly inspiring to see how their ideas, combined with the actions of so many others, created this movement that shook the foundations of American society.
Yeah, it really shows you the power of collective action, doesn't it?
It does.
And it's important to remember that change doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
it takes time, dedication, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
You're absolutely right. And even though the Black Power movement faced so much opposition and backlash,
Yeah.
it left a mark on American culture and politics that we still feel today. It did. It paved the way for so many of the gains of the civil rights movement and continues to inspire activism for social change today.
It does.
You know, it's a legacy that's both empowering and challenging, reminding us that the fight for justice is far from over.
It's not just about remembering the past,
Right.
but learning from it
Yeah.
and using that knowledge to create a more just and equitable future.
That's a great point. It's not enough to just look back. We have to use what we learn to move forward.
Right.
Okay, before we wrap up this deep dive, I have one last question for you.
Okay.
Of all the historical figures we've talked about, who do you think would be the most surprised by the world we live in today?
Oh, that's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
They'd all be blown away by how much technology has changed things.
Oh, for sure.
But I think Malcolm X might be the most intrigued by social media.
Oh, yeah. I can totally see him using Twitter to call out injustice and mobilize people for action.
Totally. He was such a brilliant communicator.
Yeah.
I think he'd be fascinated by how technology is changing the way we fight for social justice.
And maybe even a little frustrated by the fact that some of the same issues he was fighting against decades ago are still around today.
Probably, but I also think he'd be inspired by the resilience and determination of all the people who are still fighting for a more just and equitable world.
That's a really hopeful thought. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the origins of Black Power, what's one thing you want our listener to take away from this conversation?
I think the most important thing is to remember that history isn't just a collection of facts and dates.
Mm-hmm.
It's a living, breathing tapestry of ideas, actions, and consequences.
Right.
And it's our responsibility to learn from the past, engage with its complexities, and use that knowledge to create a better future.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the legacy of the Black Power movement and its continued relevance today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for diving in with us.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.